Hi, welcome to some ideas to use 20 fat quarters. This is part of our 2020 series of fat quarter ideas, and we are up to idea number 3. So in my photo here you can see I started with a stack of 20 fat quarters, and I'm adding borders and bindings and maybe the odd other little thing, but generally speaking everything's using the fat quarters except for borders and bindings and things. So we're doing a variety of different projects. So this time I'm going to show you just a mini quilt. I think this is kind of fun. It's so good for so many things. And so when we were cutting out in part 1, I showed you how we're going to cut the fat quarters, because we've started with the 20 and we've cut them all fairly specifically so that we can get the 20 projects from those 20 fat quarters. So there was a chart in part 1 of the pattern. There's a pattern for this through GourmetQuilter.com, 2020 tasty treats, 20 fat quarter ideas. And so in part 1 came all that information so that we could get started. And so I've got this whole tray of things that there were labels in part 1 as well, so that we could cut everything up from the fat quarters. So there's 20 in a stack, so there's a piece of each fat quarter in each stack, and then it labelled so that we know which ones we need for each project. So this time we're doing, as I said, idea number 3. It's the mini quilt. And so from those pre-cut pieces that we've done, I've got my piece 3 here, and we needed actually to cut 3 stacks the same. So I've used one stack piecing these up, so that we actually needed to have 60 pieces of that, rather than just the 20 for this particular project, but they're only little. And on here I've used the different binding. I've used that nice green stripe, and I've also included some of that into the quilt as well, just so that it kind of brings everything together. So I'm doing the same this time. I'm using white for my background. I've got my white border strips, and I've got my binding strips here. So again, I'm using some of that colour in the quilt. So all of that's in the notes. So pretty straightforward. I'm pretty sure you know how to sew rectangles together. We sew them all together so we have the same number of the background as we do the colours, and we sew them all together in pairs of a colour and a background. So you can chain piece those, very simple, just to sort of feed those through, and you can go through the whole stack like that. And then we're going to be joining those pairs to other pairs so that the colours alternate with the background. And again, you can just go through and chain piece. So I didn't pay a lot of attention to the colour placement. I just made sure that when I was putting the rows together that I staggered the binding fabric, the contrast fabric, so that was spread throughout the quilt. So that was probably the only thing I really did in the way of control. So I wasn't trying to control exact colour placement or anything like that. And as you can see, it comes up really well without thinking like there's 2 fabrics quite similar, they're not the same there and things. And if you were planning it, you might think, oh, I can't do that, but actually you can. So once you've made them into these little things, if you need 3 of these for each row across. So this is 1 row across. This would sit like in there so that you can see that. And then I've pressed the seams all one way. So I've made a second row, and I've included one of my binding contrast fabrics as well. And so what we end up doing is we make all the rows the same as far as starting with a colour and ending with a background, but we are going to top and tail them so that it all works together. So you can put all your rows together, and then you can kind of work out which bits go where if you're going to start looking at how things go. So what I ended up doing was pressing all the seams one way, and because we make the rows all the same, we can press all of them the same way. So it's quite a good quilt, this one, for the sort of routine type thing. We can chain piece, we can then chain piece again, we can join them up, and everything kind of works out. It's a really nice little quilt for putting together. So I'm just pushing them across. I'm not really pressing them hard at the moment, just to get them to lay flat. And now I'm going to press from the right side, so all those seams should now be going the same way, and give it a good press. So if I were to put those 2 together now, just like that, we would have all their colours together and everything, and the seams are all going that way. So if we top and tail them, which is what we want to do because we want that sort of checkerboardy type effect, our seams are now going in opposite directions, which means that they're going to nestle when we sew them together, which is just awesome because that's exactly how we want it to be. So I'll sew these 2 rows together just so that you can see for sure. So we're just using regular 1/4 inch seam allowance, and just make sure those seams are nestling, and they should all work out really nicely for you. So it's quite a lot of pieces for a small quilt, but it's very straightforward sewing because they're all just simple rectangles, and it all comes up so nicely. So I like to just make sure at each seam that it's nestling. And then we can press them in, and then I've just been pressing the seam in one direction. So you can see it comes up really nicely. It's not hard, it's quite a sort of relaxing quilt to make because everything kind of just goes together so well. So this is the start of my next row. I need to bring these ones in. So I've got more patches to sew together, but I'm not going to do that now because you now know how to sew all those rectangles together, and you can see one up behind me. I've got my border strips, so I'll do the side borders on first, and then I'll put the top and bottom on, and then I'll quilt it all, and then I will do the binding. So I've got my binding strips. So by using a piece of the binding in the quilt, even though it doesn't really relate in other ways, it works really well as far as bringing that colour in as well. So what we've got here is just a small quilt. I've quilted it. I actually used one of the wavy running stitches on my sewing machine to do the quilting, just straight down each row. There's so many different ways you can quilt things. So that when I'm quilting like that, I've got my dual feed on, and it just feeds it through nicely. So that works really well. Other than that, I think you could use this quilt for obviously a small quilt. It would make a really nice wall hanging. It would make a really nice quilt for a little doll or teddy bear, or it makes a really nice little table topper with some wonderful fabric flowers on it. So I think very versatile as a small quilt, and I hope that you enjoy idea number 3 with our fat quarters, and I will see you again with idea number 4.